Welcome back from the ad break, and let's continue with our lesson. So now we are going to be looking at the third concept of our concept map, and that is the maximum and the minimum. So let's start with the maximum. The maximum point of a graph is the highest value vertically on a graph. So let's look at an example. So for example, if we have a graph representing the rainfall in a certain area over a period of time, there will be a maximum amount of rainfall. So on which day is the rainfall at a maximum? Let's look at our graph there. We can see that there on the vertical values, we have the rainfall in milliliters. So that is the amount of rainfall. And that is why the maximum point, we look for it there on the vertical values, because we are looking for the highest vertical, meaning the day with the highest rainfall. And of course, there at our horizontal values, we have the days. So the days have been numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now the question is, on which day is the rainfall at a maximum? This means that we are looking for the highest value vertically on the graph. Can you identify that value? If you are looking at the first day, then you are absolutely correct, because we can see that on the first day, the rainfall was the highest compared to the other days. Let's look at another example. Now, this graph shows the distance traveled by a car in 4 hours. Identify the maximum distance. So in this graph, we are looking for the maximum distance or the highest distance that was covered by this car. Can you see which distance that is? Yes, there is the maximum distance, which was a distance of 200 kilometers, as we are shown there that the distance is covered in kilometers. So that was the highest distance that was traveled by this car. The graph that is given next, there it shows the number of textbooks received by learners at Lesiba Secondary School per grade. Identify the grade with the maximum number of textbooks in this graph. So we are going to look at the grade that has the highest number of textbooks. Can you see which grade that is? Well, yes, if you are looking at that point over there, then you are absolutely correct, because we can see that when it comes to the number of textbooks, that is the highest value, and that would be grade 10. What about the minimum? So in the same way that we have a maximum point, there is also a minimum point. Now, the minimum point of a graph is the lowest value vertically on a graph. For example, if we have, again, a graph representing the rainfall in a certain area over a period of time, there will be a minimum amount of rainfall. Now, we have been given that same graph that was representing the rainfall. Now, on which day is the rainfall at a minimum? Can you identify? Well, we can see that the lowest amount of rainfall was 0, meaning no rainfall at all. Now, which day or days was this minimum rainfall? Well, if you are thinking of day 3 and day 4, then you are absolutely correct, because we can see that on day 3 and day 4, there was no rainfall at all, and that is the minimum rainfall. What about this graph where that car was traveling a distance? Identify the minimum distance on the graph. Now, of course, the minimum distance would be no distance at all, and that would be a distance of 0. So we can see that the minimum distance traveled by this car, that was a distance of 0 kilometers. And what about those textbooks that were given at Lesiba Secondary School? Can we identify the minimum grade, or the grade that received the minimum number of textbooks? Well, when we are looking here, the lowest amount of textbooks is that point over there, and we can see that that is at a grade 7. So that was the minimum number of a textbook. So that is when we are looking at the minimum and the maximum points on our graph. Let's move over to the last concept in our concept map, and that is looking at discrete or continuous data. Now, what is discrete data? So discrete data is data that consists of quantities that can be counted. Now, what are we talking about when we say quantities that can be counted? Let's look at this particular graph here. Now, this data only consists of whole numbers. When we are looking at our graph, it says there the number of learners per grade at Mpho Secondary School. So on the vertical, we have the number of learners, and on the horizontal, we have the grade. So we have the grade 8s, the grade 9s, the grade 10s, 11s, and 12s. So when we are talking about discrete data, we are talking about numbers or data that consists of whole numbers only. Now, let's look at when we are looking at the number of learners. Of course, when we are counting learners, it can only be whole numbers. We cannot say that we had 330,5 or 0.5 number of learners, because we are talking about people, we are talking about whole numbers only. So these can only be counted in whole numbers, for example, at the school when we are talking about the number of learners. What about continuous data? Now, continuous data is data that consists of quantities or variables that can include fractions. Now, what are we talking about? Let's look at the particular example here. Now, we have been given the relationship between the number of kilograms and the price of sweets. So when we're looking at this graph that we've been given here, we can see that on the vertical, we have the price that is in rands, and on the horizontal axis, we have the mass of sweets, and that is in kilograms. Now, when we're looking at this type of data, can we have fractions when we are talking about kilograms or price? Yes, we can. We can absolutely have fractions there, because when we're talking about mass, it does not necessarily have to be in whole numbers. We can say that we have 1.5 or 1.5 kilograms of sweets. And when we're talking about price, it doesn't necessarily just have to be your 1 rand and your 2 rands, but we can have our sweets at a 1 rand 20 cents. And that, of course, includes fractions, in our quantities. So that is an example of continuous data. Let's look at the following graph, and let's see if we can determine whether it is continuous data or discrete data. It says there that the graph is a representation of the temperature during a week where there was a cold front in a particular city. Now, determine whether the data is continuous or discrete. Now, let's look at a temperature. When we are looking at temperature, we need to ask ourselves, does it necessarily have to be counted in whole numbers, or can there be fractions? Now, let's look at our days. We can see that on the first day, the temperature there was at about 15 degrees Celsius. Now, as we can see, it was at about 15 degrees Celsius, but when it went to the second day, it dropped. The second day, it went and it dropped to 14 degrees. But let's look at what happened between the first day and the second day. Yes, when it was dropping from 15 degrees to 14 degrees, there are temperatures in between, and that could be your 14.5 or your 14.2, but eventually when we got to the second day, it dropped to 14 degrees. But in between, we did have our fractions there that were representing the temperature at that time. So is this continuous data or discrete data? Yes, it is continuous data, because when we are looking at temperature, it can be represented as fractions. Let's look at our last graph for our lesson today, and this is the ice creams sold during a summer day. So again, the graph represents the number of ice creams that were sold within a period of 8 days during summer. Determine if this data is discrete or continuous and give a reason for your answer. So we can see that on the first day, they sold 18 ice creams. On the second day, they sold 14 ice creams, and so on and so forth. Right up until 8 days, it is represented how many ice creams were sold on each day. Now, is it possible to have sold 14 and a half number of ice creams on a particular day? Absolutely not. We cannot have fractions when we are talking about the number of ice creams sold. So what does this mean? Is this discrete data or continuous data? Well, if you are thinking of discrete data, then you are absolutely correct, because this type of data can only be worked with whole numbers. Then we must say that this is a discrete data. We cannot have fractions when we are working with the number of ice creams. Thank you for joining us for this lesson. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. Hope to see you next time. Goodbye.